Todos.
Before the ship ever touched the ocean, the journey had already begun in fear and loss. For countless African men, women, and children, life on a slave ship did not start at sea. It began far inland, in villages that had stood for generations. Some were taken during sudden raids at dawn. Others were sold through local trading networks shaped by violence and pressure. Families were separated without warning. Names, languages, and identities were stripped away in a matter of moments. Those captured were forced to march hundreds of miles toward the coast. The journey was long and unforgiving. Many were bound together, moving under the constant watch of armed guards. Weakness was not tolerated. Hunger, exhaustion, and illness followed every step, and those who fell behind were often left behind forever. By the time the coastline appeared, survival itself had already become a test of endurance. At the shore, stone forts and wooden barracks awaited. Here, captives were confined for weeks or even months, held in crowded rooms with little light or fresh air. The waiting was filled with uncertainty and fear. People could hear the ocean, but they did not yet know what it would carry them toward. This period of confinement was designed to break resistance and erase hope before the ships ever set sail. When the day came, the final walk to the ship was short but decisive. The vessels looming in the harbor were unlike anything many had seen before. Once aboard, the past was cut off completely, and an unknown future began. If this story matters to you, please take a moment to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and stay with us as we uncover the human stories behind this history. The moment the captives were forced across the narrow planks and onto the ship, the waiting of the coastal forts gave way to a new reality, one that felt even more confined and overwhelming. The sea stretched endlessly beyond the harbor, yet inside the vessel space disappeared almost entirely. Below deck, the air was heavy and unmoving, carrying the smell of damp wood, sweat, and fear. Light filtered in only through small openings, barely enough to see the faces of those pressed together in the darkness. People were arranged with careful calculation, not for comfort but for capacity. Bodies were positioned side by side on rough wooden platforms, with so little room that turning over required effort and cooperation. Sitting upright for long periods was often impossible, and lying down meant resting against another person who was just as exhausted and frightened. For many, the ship felt less like a means of travel and more like a sealed container where time slowed and space lost all meaning. As the vessel moved farther from land, the lack of fresh air became suffocating. Heat built up below deck, especially as the sun rose and fell each day. Breathing grew harder, and the sound of coughing and labored breaths echoed through the cramped interior. Moisture clung to the walls and floors, making the wooden surfaces slippery and cold at night. In these conditions, even small injuries became dangerous, and sickness spread quickly among those who had no way to escape it. Daily life was reduced to endurance. There was no privacy, no quiet, and no relief from the constant closeness of others. Children clung to adults, while elders struggled to conserve what little strength remained. The darkness blurred the passage of time, turning days into an unbroken stretch of discomfort and uncertainty. Above deck, the world was open and bright. But below, the captives existed in a space designed to be unseen. The ship itself became a moving boundary between the lives they had known and the futures they could not yet imagine. Each creak of the wood and roll of the waves reinforced the feeling of isolation. The ocean, vast and powerful, surrounded them on all sides, yet offered no sense of freedom. Instead, it emphasized how completely they were cut off from land, from family, and from any familiar point of reference. Despite the oppressive conditions, people found ways to remain present, listening for familiar voices in the darkness or holding on to fragments of memory as a form of quiet resistance. In a space where movement was restricted and air was scarce, the struggle to remain conscious, to breathe steadily, and to survive each passing hour became the central rhythm of life on board. The overcrowded decks were not only a physical environment but a test of human endurance, marking the beginning of a journey defined by confinement, uncertainty, and profound loss. As the ship settled into its long journey across the ocean, confinement took on a new and more personal form. Beyond the narrow space and the heavy air below deck, iron restraints became a constant presence in daily life. Women and children were fastened together in ways that limited even the smallest movements, turning every shift of the body into a shared effort. The sound of metal against wood and skin blended with the creaking of the ship, creating a rhythm that followed them day and night. The restraints were not only physical but deeply symbolic. Being bound to strangers erased any remaining sense of independence, forcing people into unwanted closeness that made rest difficult and dignity harder to preserve. Simple actions such as stretching, adjusting one's position, or reaching for a child became slow and complicated. Every movement reminded them that control over their own bodies had been taken away, replaced by a system designed to manage people as cargo rather than as human beings. Over time, the weight of the iron became more than a burden on the limbs. It pressed into the mind, shaping how people experienced each passing hour. The inability to choose when to stand, sit, or turn over made time feel distorted. Moments that might once have passed unnoticed now required patience and coordination. In the darkness below deck, even sleep came in fragments, interrupted by discomfort and the constant presence of restraints that never truly loosened. Yet within this imposed closeness, human relationships continued to form. Some offered quiet reassurance to those beside them, sharing whispered words or steady breathing to ease fear. Parents found ways to comfort children despite the limitations, using touch and voice rather than movement. These small acts of care stood in contrast to the purpose of the restraints, which were meant to isolate and control. In their own limited way, people reclaimed a sense of connection that the iron could not fully erase. The experience of being bound also deepened the sense of uncertainty about what lay ahead. With each day at sea, the restraints reinforced the reality that this journey was not temporary, and that the future would likely bring new forms of control. The ship moved forward. But for those below deck, progress felt measured only in endurance. The iron links served as a constant reminder that their lives were being directed by forces beyond their reach. As the ocean stretched endlessly around them, the loss of personal autonomy became one of the most defining aspects of life on board. Movement, choice, and privacy were replaced by dependence and constraint. Still, within these harsh limits, people continued to think, remember, and hope. The restraints could restrict bodies, but they could not fully silence the inner world of those who endured them, nor erase the quiet determination to survive the journey, no matter how heavy the chains felt with each passing day. As the days at sea stretched into weeks, hunger and thirst became as constant as the darkness below deck and the weight of the restraints. Food was distributed sparingly, more as a calculation than a gesture of care. Portions were small, repetitive, and unfamiliar, offered at set times that did little to restore strength. For those who had already endured long marches and confinement along the coast, these rations were never enough to replace what had been lost. Water, more than food, became the center of daily thought. Each serving was carefully measured, and the fear of it running out lingered in every swallow. Dry mouths and aching throats made speaking difficult, and the effort of breathing in the stale air only increased the sense of thirst. People learned to sip slowly, aware that once the cup was empty, relief would not come again for many hours. The body weakened quietly, not all at once, but through a steady draining of energy that left even the simplest movements exhausting. The lack of nourishment affected everyone differently. Some grew visibly thinner with each passing day, their strength fading as their bodies struggled to adjust. Others became weak more suddenly, overcome by dizziness or fatigue that made it hard to remain alert. Children, already vulnerable, depended on adults who themselves were barely holding on. In the crowded space below deck, it was impossible to escape the sight of suffering, as hunger and dehydration revealed themselves in sunken faces and unsteady hands. As physical strength declined, illness found easier ground. Bodies weakened by lack of food and water could no longer resist infections that spread quickly in the confined environment. Minor discomforts became serious problems, and recovery was slow, if it came at all. The connection between hunger, thirst, and sickness became clear to those enduring the voyage. Even if there was nothing they could do to change it, each missed meal or insufficient drink made the body less able to endure the next challenge. Despite this, people developed small strategies to survive. Some saved a portion of food for later, while others shared what little they had with a child or a struggling neighbor. These acts, though limited in their effect, carried emotional weight. They represented choices made in a situation where choice was rare, moments of humanity preserved in the face of constant deprivation. Time at sea seemed to revolve around the anticipation of the next ration. The sound of footsteps above deck or the opening of hatches signaled brief moments of attention, followed by long hours of waiting. Hunger sharpened memory, causing people to recall meals from their past lives, familiar tastes tied to home and family. These memories were painful, but they also served as reminders of identity, helping some hold on to a sense of self even as their bodies weakened. In this way, hunger and thirst were not only physical hardships but forces that shaped every aspect of life on board. They slowed movement, blurred thought, and increased vulnerability, turning survival into a daily struggle measured in endurance rather than hope. Yet even as nourishment remained scarce and strength continued to fade, the desire to live persisted, carried quietly from one day to the next across the endless water. As weakness spread through the ship from hunger, thirst, and exhaustion, illness soon followed, moving silently through the crowded space below deck. In the dim light, it was often hard to tell when sickness began, as many symptoms blended into the general fatigue that had already taken hold. Gradually, however, the signs became impossible to ignore. People grew feverish, their movements slowed, and their voices weakened. What had once been individual suffering became a shared reality, felt by nearly everyone confined within the vessel. The conditions that defined life on board allowed illness to travel easily from one person to the next. Limited ventilation, constant dampness, and close contact made recovery difficult and prevention nearly impossible. Bodies already strained by lack of nourishment were unable to fight infections that might have been survivable under different circumstances. As days passed, more people lay motionless for long periods, their strength fading as the ship continued its steady progress across the ocean. Those who became seriously ill were rarely separated from the rest. There was no space for isolation, no quiet place for rest. Instead, sickness unfolded in full view of others, adding to the emotional weight of the journey. Children watched adults grow weaker, and adults struggled with the fear of not being able to protect those who depended on them. The air below deck grew heavier, filled not only with the smell of the ship and the sea, but with the tension of constant uncertainty. Loss became a recurring presence. When someone did not wake or could no longer respond, the reality of death was quickly understood by those nearby. There was little time for mourning and no opportunity for traditional farewells. The routines of the ship continued, indifferent to individual lives. When bodies were removed from below deck, the moment was brief and quiet, marked by silence rather than ceremony. For those who remained, the absence was deeply felt, leaving behind empty spaces that reminded everyone how fragile survival had become. Each passing loss reshaped the emotional landscape of the voyage. Fear mixed with numbness, as people tried to protect themselves from constant grief. Some withdrew inward, conserving energy not only of the body but of the spirit. Others leaned more heavily on memory, recalling stories, songs, or familiar faces from home as a way to cope with the steady erosion of hope. In a place where illness and death felt ever present, remembering life before the ship became a form of endurance. The crew above deck measured the journey in distance and time, but for those below, it was measured in who remained and who did not. Mortality was not an abstract idea. It was visible, personal, and ongoing. Each day of survival carried the awareness that the next day was uncertain. The sea outside, vast and unchanging, seemed to absorb these losses without pause, continuing its motion as though untouched by human suffering. Yet even in the shadow of illness and loss, the will to survive did not disappear entirely. Those who endured learned to take strength from one another, offering comfort through presence rather than words. A hand, a shared glance, or a whispered reminder of home became small acts of resistance against despair. Life on the ship was shaped by sickness and death, but it was also defined by the quiet determination of those who continued to breathe, remember, and endure, carrying their humanity with them across the unforgiving water. Beneath the oppressive weight of the ship, where darkness and illness already defined daily existence, another force took hold, one that reached beyond the physical constraints of space and disease into the realm of fear itself. The crew above deck enforced rules with a mixture of routine cruelty and calculated intimidation, ensuring that captives remained subdued and compliant. Every shout, every sharp command, every harsh gesture was a reminder that resistance carried immediate and severe consequences. The presence of authority was constant, felt in every movement, every attempt to shift or whisper, and in the cold knowledge that defiance might be met with punishment. Even in the confined darkness, the sound of footsteps on the deck above could send shivers through those below, a reminder that freedom of movement had been stripped away. Whispers spread quickly among the captives, describing what had happened to someone who had spoken too loudly, or moved too quickly, or simply been noticed. These stories became part of the daily rhythm of fear, each tale reinforcing the understanding that survival depended on vigilance, obedience, and careful observation. In such an environment, the mind was as constrained as the body, constantly weighing each action against potential danger. The psychological pressure was compounded by the unpredictability of punishment. No one could fully anticipate when the next reprimand would come, and this uncertainty kept everyone on edge. Children huddled closer to adults, seeking reassurance and protection, while adults struggled to maintain composure despite their own terror. Trust, already scarce, became a fragile commodity, as people learned to guard not only their bodies but their words and expressions. The ship's confined quarters turned every glance and every movement into potential evidence of disobedience, and the constant surveillance created an invisible network of control that extended beyond physical restraints. Within this environment, small acts of defiance were risky but significant. A whispered word of encouragement, a shared story, a quiet attempt to comfort another, all became subtle ways to preserve dignity and humanity. These acts required courage, because they existed under the shadow of immediate reprisal. Yet even in a place designed to break spirits, such moments of quiet resilience served as a reminder that the human mind and heart could endure more than the body alone. The captives' awareness of their vulnerability did not erase their inner life. It reshaped it, sharpening instincts, cultivating solidarity, and fostering a sense of shared survival. The interplay between fear and endurance defined life on the ship. Every day was a negotiation between maintaining presence of mind and complying with imposed authority, between protecting oneself and offering small gestures of care to others. The environment above and below deck worked in concert to suppress rebellion, but it could not fully extinguish the inner determination to survive. Even as fear permeated every movement and every interaction, the captives retained an awareness of their own identity and a quiet hope that the journey, however brutal, might one day end. In this way, the routine presence of violence and intimidation became both a method of control and a measure of resilience. Life on the ship was marked not only by the suffering inflicted, but also by the subtle acts of courage that persisted despite it. Each breath drawn under the heavy air, each shared glance in the dim light, each whispered word of comfort or memory was a quiet assertion of humanity, refusal to be entirely subdued, and a testament to the enduring spirit of those who lived through the unimaginable confines of the Middle Passage. Even in the suffocating darkness below deck, where iron restraints held bodies and fear shaped every movement, the human spirit found ways to assert itself. Life on the ship was designed to erase identity and crush will, yet captives discovered small, powerful ways to resist, insisting on their presence in a world that sought to deny it. Acts of defiance emerged quietly at first, in subtle refusals to obey, in the careful hoarding of scraps of food, and in whispered exchanges that preserved memory and identity. These gestures, though small, were profound statements that the self had not been fully erased. Some captives turned to hunger as a form of protest, refusing the meager rations that arrived each day. Though their bodies grew weaker and frailty set in, these acts were a declaration of agency in circumstances designed to strip them of choice. In others, despair mingled with courage in acts that the captors could not fully control, including attempts to sabotage the ship's functioning or disrupt routines, revealing the quiet strength and ingenuity that persisted even under relentless oppression. Each small act was a refusal to be treated solely as cargo, a claim to autonomy that defied the structures imposed by the voyage. Occasional uprisings, though risky and often brutally suppressed, illuminated the unyielding desire for freedom. When captives coordinated in these rare moments, the ship became a stage for resistance that could not be ignored. Even when rebellion failed, the very attempt carried meaning beyond immediate success or failure. It was a visible assertion that people would not simply surrender to dehumanization, that courage could exist even under impossible constraints. These moments were reminders that humanity cannot be entirely extinguished, no matter the brutality of the environment. The strategies of resistance were diverse and deeply personal. Some preserved their sense of self through memory and song, recalling stories of home, family, and community, using them as anchors against despair. Others found solidarity in shared struggle, holding the hand of a neighbor, offering a comforting word, or simply surviving together. These connections became lifelines, reinforcing the notion that even in confinement, people could resist psychologically and emotionally, preserving dignity when physical freedom was denied. Such acts of resilience were interwoven with the daily realities of illness, hunger, and fear, creating a complex tapestry of suffering and endurance. The ship's dark corridors witnessed both vulnerability and defiance, and each day survived was itself a quiet rebellion. Captives discovered that survival required more than strength of body, it demanded imagination, courage, and the ability to hold on to humanity in an environment designed to strip it away. In this way, life on the slave ship was defined not only by the cruelty endured, but also by the persistence of agency under extreme conditions. Resistance, whether in the form of silent refusal, clever subversion, or coordinated revolt, was an assertion of selfhood against overwhelming odds. It demonstrated that even in spaces constructed to deny identity, fear, and autonomy, the human spirit could endure, finding expression in acts both large and small, defying the very purpose of the Middle Passage and preserving a sense of humanity that could not be chained or extinguished. When the ship finally reached its destination, the journey across the ocean had already left an indelible mark on those who survived. Women and children who had endured confinement, hunger, disease, and fear now stepped onto land with bodies weakened and spirits worn thin. Every movement carried the memory of weeks spent in darkness, chained to strangers, struggling to survive in conditions no human being should endure. Yet there was no respite, no welcoming hand, no moment of relief. Their ordeal was far from over. As they were guided off the ship, the captives faced a new form of control. Inspectors and traders assessed each person with a detached efficiency, evaluating strength, age, and perceived value, reducing human beings to numbers and measurements. Families, already separated by capture and the Middle Passage, were often further divided here, torn apart according to market needs rather than personal bonds. The weight of loss compounded, leaving invisible scars alongside the physical ones carried from the voyage. Branding and sale followed quickly, marking the survivors as property and formally initiating the next chapter of a life already shaped by suffering. The same hands that had confined them below deck now held the power to decide their futures, determining where they would labor, under whose authority, and under what conditions. The transition from one form of captivity to another was swift and relentless, emphasizing that survival of the ship was only a partial victory against a system designed to dominate every aspect of life. Even in this harsh reality, traces of resilience persisted. The endurance that carried captives through the Middle Passage, small acts of resistance, shared comfort, and preservation of identity remained within them. Memory, story, and hope became tools for survival, sustaining spirit in circumstances where choice and autonomy had been stripped away. Though the path ahead promised more hardship, these remnants of humanity served as a quiet defiance against a world intent on dehumanization. The story of the Middle Passage is one of both unimaginable suffering and enduring human spirit. It reminds us of the resilience of those who lived through it, the courage found in acts of quiet resistance, and the power of hope in even the darkest conditions. By remembering these experiences, we honor their lives, their struggles, and their determination to survive in a system that sought to erase them completely. Thank you for watching and taking the time to learn about this history. If this story resonated with you, please like the video, subscribe to the channel, and join us as we continue to explore the human stories behind history, shining light on experiences that deserve to be remembered and understood.